Well, hello, everybody. Sorry I'm late. We will go ahead and call roll to get this meeting started.
Agent.
Here.
Clegg.
Here. Oh,
Sanchez.
Here.
Willits. Here. Whittings. Here. All present.
Thanks. First up, we've got Eric Bemoria with some interim budget changes.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor, members of the council. We have 4 interim budget changes for your consideration this afternoon. 2 of those interim budget changes are funded by the American Rescue Plan, and the other 2 are funded by the Open Space and Clean Water Levy Fund. The first one is a American Rescue Plan Act investment. It would cover administration costs associated with the overall American Rescue Plan. The amount, $286,000, is within the amount that was approved by the City Council in May of 2022. It's recommended now, as when we built the fiscal year 23 budget, we did not have a firm estimate on how much was going to be required within the current fiscal year. The second item is supported out of the Foothills Levy Fund. It allows for a carbon mapping project within the city's open space reserves to determine how much capacity the open spaces have to store more carbon, identify what open space features such as plant species and soil composition are the most impactful for carbon sequestration, and provide insight into where future acquisition efforts should be focused to maximize carbon storage. Our third item is a property acquisition to allow for the future park development, a future park development within West Boise on Shamrock Street. This item here would allow for the property acquisition. In the future, there would be a public process to determine the types of amenities that would go into that park. At some period to be determined. Our fourth item is an American Rescue Plan Act item. It is for the conversion of certain building systems from natural gas to electricity. Natural gas emissions currently generate about just under 10% of overall city emissions. We can't reduce those emissions without moving to a cleaner energy source such as electricity. It's anticipated that in addition to reducing carbon emissions, this move could increase energy efficiency, resulting in long-term cost savings. This project, similar to the administration one I mentioned earlier, was contemplated in the fiscal year 23 budget build and is within the amounts approved by council when they made their original funding recommendations back in May of 2022. This action is simply moving the funds out of the general fund and into the capital fund where we will account for that project. With that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Looks like there are none. Thank you, Eric.
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
I move we approve the FY 2023 interim budget changes for January 10th, 2023 as presented.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Clerk, will you call the roll?
Agent.
yes.
Clegg.
Yes.
Halliburton.
Yes.
Sanchez.
Yes.
Willits. Yes. Whittings.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. And now we've got Tim Keene and team. There's a whole bunch of you I see that are here for this to present the Central Bench Transportation Plan. Is this just a staff presentation? Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mayor, members of council. Tim Keene, Director of Planning and Development Services. I'm going to go through these slides here. There are others in attendance that know much more about this than I do. And thank Justin Lucas for attending this meeting from ACHD, one of our partners. We've been talking a lot about this in the last several weeks. I also want to introduce Tessa Greger, who's here, who recently joined us in the planning department. She's in Jessica Zelag's team in the planning area, leading our mobility and public spaces team. Hope you all know Tessa. We're excited to have Tessa with us. I've discussed this with you back to when we were going into the 2023 budget and really beefing up our team that works on transportation, mobility related work in the city and the importance of public spaces as it relates to that. So we're thrilled to have Tessa here with us. So I'm going to go through some slides here. This came up at a meeting that you had, I think in early December, related to a development proposal on Victory Road on the bench. And we actually have two development proposals on Victory. You have the one tonight, which is called Seasons on the Bench, and then one you'll be seeing very soon that went to Planning and Zoning Commission in December, and it will be coming to council, I think, in February. But the discussion around these developments prompted some bigger discussions about connectivity and bike and pedestrian infrastructure and the lack of it, or what's coming, and how that relates to ACHD's 5-year work plan. And so the request was that we step back for a minute and discuss just that very thing as you all are considering these important developments on Victory. And so I'm going to go through a few slides to give you some context. Regarding ACHD's 5-year work plan, it's updated annually, and they seek our recommendations as to what, or not recommendations, they ask us for our priorities as it relates to those annual updates. So we actually have a full review of that scheduled for your January 31st meeting, where we'll talk about citywide priorities, for the whole city as it relates to the update of the 5-year work plan. Tonight, of course, we're really discussing the Central Bench and specifically the area that's most impacted by these new developments, Vista over to Federal Way, and from the canal north to Canal, and then even north of there. So we're really concentrating on that area, but you will be discussing this 5-year work plan at your work session on January 31st. Then we've got these different plans that relate to this area, including ACHD Central Bench Neighborhood Transportation Plan, which is recently adopted by the ACHD Commission, but also these others that I'm going to be referencing because they have to do with the connectivity that exists or doesn't exist as it relates to Victory, these new developments, those neighborhoods, and how they connect to the surrounding streets. So here is ACHD's bike network, and I'll show you the city pathway map in just a second, but I think this shows, yeah, so here's the area we're specifically discussing, but you can see the context around it as it relates to ACHD's plan for a bike network. And what you'll see here is these blue lines, which include Victory itself, and then Canal to the north of it, and other streets in blue, which is in terms of the hierarchy of bike infrastructure as it relates to ACHD's network. The blue ones are the ones where you have the least amount of infrastructure. So it could be Sharrows. Basically, the idea, of course, is that bikes are working in the streets. That's what the blue lines represent, but you can see the connectivity here over to Federal Way and the Federal Way pathway, which exists. And among the discussions at your meeting recently was the issue of how do you get from the neighborhoods over to the pathway on Federal Way. So you see it there in purple, purple being the most infrastructure as it relates to bikes and pedestrians. And in that case, it's the pathway on Federal Way. And then this here is the pathways plan, which I'm showing you this, just it's consistent, obviously, with the ACHD network, but it also includes the pathway that runs along the New York Canal here. So in the plan, this is important because in the planning we've done with the developers in question, that pathway has been embraced and is being implemented as the plans suggest. And more than just including the pathway and saying, okay, we'll do that, we actually have the developers really designing around that pathway. It will be a really extraordinary space for not just the people that live in the new developments, but for the whole neighborhood to connect to. Then with regard to the work program, this is the current ACHD 5-year work plan. And you can see kind of the sequencing of things that are in there as currently composed. So the green here is the active stuff, which was really bikeway signage. And then you can go through the hierarchy here, most closely aligned with that area around Victory and Vista and Federal Way. You'll see some of that bikeway or a bike signage, I'm sorry, in green, but also the gray lines there that provide some connectivity or in the future. That includes the crossing of the railroad track, which was much discussed. And it was discussed at your meeting that it was in the 5-year work plan, but as you can see, it was a kind of a future thing to invest in. We've been talking with ACHD about making that a higher priority again, of course. I'll come back to that in a minute. But that also includes a couple of, well, I'll show some other maps that get zero in on this area in just a moment. So yeah, here it is. Okay, so this is the one specifically that was discussed so much in its relationship to the 5-year work plan. So on Victory and that crossing of the railroad, and the discussion was primarily around the sidewalk, the lack of a sidewalk connection. And you'll remember the photographs of the cliff adjacent to the railroad right of way, and legitimate, obviously, concerns about that. And so in the 5-year work plan, that is, as I said, in an out year, not really programmed, just identified as something we need to be concerned about. Then also up here at Malad and over to Federal Way, and questions about additional bike pedestrian facilities, and then also the crossing of Federal Way. And so there are plans for additional sidewalks here, which again, we can talk about making a higher priority in the 5-year work plan. There are some commitments that have been made with regard to these developers to participate, that are working on Victory, to participate in the improvements that are needed offsite over here towards Federal Way. That does include, I'm trying to remember what other maps are here. Yeah, that does include in terms of the requirements for the developers. This is getting into the development itself, which is later on your agenda, but just to point out at Malad and Federal Way that there be a pedestrian signal installed there. One other thing though is too, that we've been discussing in the context of coming back to council around priorities for this work plan update, some discussion of Victory, certainly as it relates to the railroad crossing, but maybe even over to Federal Way, because you probably know, I don't know if, well, I'm kind of getting into this here. Next steps for the 5-year work plan would include discussing with you, bringing up in priority some of the sidewalk improvements there, but also adding to the scope of that railroad crossing, such that we're including a bike facility there as well. And we were discussing perhaps even looking at that where Victory gets to Federal Way, which is a bit of it's close. It's a little bit of an awkward situation there because you have a crossing of Federal Way kind of right before the interchange. If you're going south, right before you get to the Broadway interchange, there's a crossing there, which gets you over to the pathway. But Victory, which comes towards that intersection, doesn't quite have the facility it needs for bike. So to maybe add to that, to identify that area, it's all within right of way, so that's good. But to make some improvements there. So what we're expecting then is that at your January 31st meeting, we'll have a discussion around the broader city priorities as it relates to the 5-year work plan update, but also we're expecting to come to you with higher priorities here for this neighborhood as it relates to these improvements, and expanding the scope perhaps even a little bit as it relates to Victory and the railroad crossing, and Victory and its connection to Federal Way's pathway. So I think that's my last slide, and happy to answer questions about what I've presented tonight, or ask someone to answer questions if needed.
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
I'll kick it off. So we're talking about the railroad crossing at Victory, and then also a little bit about Malad. I don't think that there's a single railroad crossing until you get down to Overland that has any sort of pedestrian or bicycle facilities. Is that correct?
I can't confirm that. Can any? Yeah, we think that's true.
I mean, looking
Council member.
at the map, that's what it looks like. Sometimes the maps are out of date, Google Maps. And so you said that the Malad Railroad crossing is one of the projects that is identified in the 5-year work plan.
The Malad sidewalks and including the railroad crossing is within the 5-year work plan, but it's not identified for funding or
Yep.
any particular year.
But the Victory one isn't. The Victory one is kind of like just in the future, not actually identified in that.
Well, no, it's identified. It's just that it doesn't have funding in a particular year. So the two, let me go back to that. So you can see them here. They're actually the same in terms of how they're designated within the 5-year work plan. They're in gray here. So they're identified, but they don't have funding associated with them. They don't have a year, they're kind of an out year. So that whole collection of things we need to zero in on and decide, should that be in our 5-year work plan update as a high priority and try to just discuss where it sits on our priority list. I mean, obviously we're going to be coming to you with that recommendation, but we'll have to discuss where it sits among all our priorities.
And Madam Mayor, one more follow-up. And Tim, I think that you've already said this before, so I apologize for asking something that I think you've already went over. Do we anticipate construction on Malad as far as development goes sooner than we anticipate on Victory that we're seeing tonight?
No,
No,
I don't think so.
Victory is probably where we would see it first,
I think so.
I
Yeah.
believe. Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you. So a little bit of follow-up on that. I think if I'm understanding Councilmember Halliburton's last question correctly, should we be asking at that 5-year work program review for the crossing and the facilities on Victory to be prioritized ahead of any improvements on Malad?
Well, it's interesting just because, all of this relates to the development that we're anticipating and that you're reviewing on Victory. So the question all the Malad discussion over to Federal Way has to do with what those impacts are and how people get around and the safety of people walking and biking and so forth. So, I mean, it's all part of one issue, really. It's a matter of, and probably we'll have to work through that, and including with ACHD to talk about, what's the scale of that improvement? What's the cost of it? How long will it take? Those kinds of things, just to think through the sequencing of these things. But they're all kind of the same priority because they're responding to new development and how that will impact streets in the existing neighborhood.
Mhm. So a second question that I have, again, Councilmember Halliburton brings up that there's not a good crossing of this railroad up in this part of the bench that includes pedestrian facilities. Other than in the really urban parts of the city, I've been looking for really good examples of how to do pedestrian and bike facilities on these crossings well. And as I look at the Livable Streets Guide, I didn't see a really good example. So do we know what kinds of improvements we'll be asking for, what they'll look like, what our expectation is in terms of those?
I mean, we haven't looked at it close enough really to know what the design solution is at either of these intersections, whether it's Victory or Malad. So I think we'd want to hold off on that. Maybe we can have a little bit more of an idea, when we come back on January 31st, but we haven't looked closely at what the right design solution is.
Yeah. So these are one place where we don't have a canned design that we work
Yeah, it's
from to
pretty
begin
custom.
with. And so I guess for me, it also brings up then the question of let's figure out what are the criteria we'd like to see met with that design rather than us trying to say, do a particular design. Is that
Yeah,
probably
I
the
think
best
so.
way to approach it?
Right. And, as I showed in those slides, ACHD has this, design happening sometime in the future. We really haven't gotten into that yet, but there will be a solution. Question is,
Okay.
how expensive will it be?
My last question, we can't separate this really from the two applications that we have both before us tonight and coming forward. And so as part of this, in the past, ACHD has been willing to allow developers to go forward with building some of these kinds of improvements in return for some forgiveness of impact fees. And I wonder if any of that has been discussed.
Yeah, not yet, council member.
Okay. Just seems like,
Yeah, that's a
maybe
great
as we
point.
look at what the solution is to get these done in the timely manner with those
Mhm.
developments, that might be one thing to
Because,
consider.
to your point, the developers have been willing, as you know, throughout this process, they've been willing to make whatever improvements we've decided are needed in association with this development. So any decision to speed up some of these improvements through their investment are things that we should absolutely figure out.
Thank you.
Mayor. Yep. I don't really have any questions for Tim, just more comments. I know that you guys will have a lot to contend with on deciding what gets pushed off to future years in the 5-year work plan, and that's going to be a really tough decision process. And I wish you the very best in that work, because I know that it's going to be really tough. It's so interesting to me that these things are brought to our attention via development applications. It's like, oh, I didn't actually think about before that there's not a sufficient pedestrian and bike crossing across the railroad tracks between Overland and, where's the next one? There's really not one. So bringing up these
The green belt.
bringing up these deficiencies, it just, it's both great that we're getting development. It's hard because now we are faced with a new set of decisions on what we prioritize. But I do think that this connectivity makes a whole lot of sense. And without this application, we wouldn't have known about it, which is really interesting. I liked Council President Clegg's suggestion on looking at different ways that we can treat impact fees. And I know that I've said this again, and I'm going to start sounding like a broken record on it, but it's a frustration that this development is going to pay huge impact fees to ACHD. Those impact fees are going to be shipped out to support development of roads that beget more urban sprawl instead of staying in the city where they're improving our transportation system locally. And this is not a criticism of ACHD. It's just a frustration that I've had for a long time that interpretation of where we can use impact fees doesn't allow us to really use those to do smart infill development and improve a deficient transportation system where it's been built years ago and is no longer supporting the needs of neighborhoods. So I just wanted to register that once again. And hopefully that's something that we can look at policy-wise in the future to remedy. So
You've
all I got.
Halliburton and then Sanchez.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, just a quick comment here. When we're looking at this, there's the bicycle infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure, and it's maybe debatable on whether or not a Shero still qualifies as bicycle infrastructure that's really going to get people comfortable out there riding. But I think one thing we know for sure is that it's not going to make it easier for somebody who's trying to walk across those railroad crossings. And so in my mind, I'd love to see more bicycle connection anywhere we can possibly get it. But like the real emphasis here is how do we make sure somebody can walk across this that doesn't have transportation options or is trying to get to a bus route or is maybe using a walker or a wheelchair. And so I think that that's the biggest concern, especially on the Victory one, but on both locations, is not just can we put a Sharrow on there, but can we make it so that people can walk across to the other side?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Tim, and I think this question might be for the gentleman from ACHD. Typically, how long or how many of these projects actually come to fruition during those 5-year plans? Is it 100%, 80%, 50%? Because I know a lot of it's tied to funding. Just wondering what that looks like.
Good evening, Madam Mayor. For the record, my name is Justin Lucas. I'm the Deputy Director of Planning and Project Management at the Highway District. It's nice to see you all. I don't get to come here very often. It's good to see you. Councilmember Sanchez, it's a really good question. You know, there's a lot of projects in that plan, hundreds and hundreds of projects. But typically when a project is identified with a design year, for example, this section of Victory, this isn't the right slide, but I believe this section of Victory has a design year established. Once it gets a design year, they pretty much move. You can potentially move that design year up depending on the priority. But once you get a project going on design, they move pretty well. I would say within 3 to 5 years, most projects that that complete design are completed in construction. The timeline is typically controlled by the necessary right-of-way that is required, which can be lots of negotiations there. And specifically with the railroad crossings, the railroad or the operator of the railroad plays a significant role in the process. They have to approve all of the designs that are basically proposed within the railroad right-of-way. There's a hierarchy when it comes to right-of-way, and the railroad right-of-way was established long before the ACHD right-of-way. So basically, they get to tell us what they're going to allow within their right-of-way. We work with them a lot, but it is a lengthy process to work with the railroad. But getting that design going and started is one of the keys. So I don't know if that perfectly answers your question, but I hope that at least that idea of once you get design going, you're making progress. And it would be very rare for ACHD to start design on a project and not construct it within, I would say, a 3 to 5 year period.
Thank you. And so within those that have a date assigned to them, what percentage would you say actually are completed in that 3 to 5 year timeline?
I would say 90+% of projects that have a date associated with design are completed within that 3 to 5 year timeline.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Madam Mayor. Tim, thank you so much. This is really insightful. And Justin, you may not want to sit down because this may end up going to you. You know, I think about all of the different developments that we get, and 95% of the objections are infrastructure and transportation and how you get people here and there. So we clearly have some things that we want to have happen. We want it in the 5-year work plan. ACHD has a lot of competition when it comes to other municipalities. How do we get what we want? I mean, what if they say, nope, we're gonna give this to another Ada County city? Then what's our recourse here?
Hi, Council Member Willits, Madam Mayor. It's a good question. I think if you were to look at the City of Boise's current integrated 5-year work plan request list, you would see that the majority of the projects in your top 20 are moving forward in some form or fashion. I think you have the State Street Corridor highly prioritized within your prioritization list. And there is a lot of action on that corridor and a lot of investment that has gone in. And certainly there's a lot of discussions about how to continue that investment. When it comes to the specific sidewalk and pedestrian bicyclist projects that we work on. ACHD over the years has completed probably hundreds of projects since we significantly started this plan. Since my time at ACHD, this is about 15 years ago, hundreds of projects within the city of Boise. We've completed a lot of projects on the bench. So what I'm getting at to respond to your question is, if the city prioritizes a project high on your list, and the ACHD Commission has been very responsive to those requests. And I think if you were to go and look at the bench, we're completing projects now and have completed many that have been high priorities historically. Roosevelt's being completed, Kootenai's being completed. These were very high priority projects for the city of Boise. And if indeed this area becomes a higher priority due to this potential pressure from the development, I think ACHD has the ability to respond to that. Even some of those projects in gray that show a design year that's a little further out, is it possible to move those forward? Certainly it is. There's always a shuffling and trade-offs. I have to be honest, as with anything, there's a fiscal constraint. But if that becomes a higher priority for the city, I think ACHD has the ability to respond. And I speak on behalf of those that are doing the project programming. Ultimately, the commission, they can make a project move very quickly if they designate it to go. It's going to go pretty darn quick. So there's a lot of moving parts there, but I think this annual process is predictable. I think it's transparent. You have a list. We have the ability to respond, and we've been doing this. I think, I hope, in a way that is responsive to the needs of the city of Boise. Oftentimes, there's always challenges and funding issues, but for the most part, I think there's been a lot of really good collaboration in these types of areas, and we look to continue that.
Well, thank you. We look forward to continuing to collaborate as well. I think that's it. Doesn't look like there's any more. So let's move into the zoning code rewrite. We've got till 5:30. I didn't say it that way because we can go longer. I said it that way because we might have less time, but no, we're supposed to be here till 5:30. And then we have about a 5-minute executive session.
Mayor, members of the council, I'm going to give you an update on where we stand with the zoning code rewrite. And first couple of slides I wanted to show you relates to what this opportunity is that the city's facing right now to address how we grow as a city. And this, Councilmember Willits, gets a little bit to your last point in the previous conversation about all these demands we have for infrastructure in the city associated with new development. So I wanted to provide a little bit of context here about how cities have grown. And I've used 1970 as a date here because at that time, cities in this country, including Boise, were creating new zoning ordinances. So the last zoning ordinance we put together here in Boise was 1966, as was the case in these other cities. And what these charts will show you is they were hugely successful. So here in Atlanta, Georgia's case, at the time, the city's population was a high percentage of the region. The city's population was 500,000 people. The regional population was 1.8 million. Today, the region has grown to 6 million people, and the city's population is still 500,000 people. So there's been this massive consumption of land associated with the previous period of development that was enacted through all these zoning ordinances. So success has been realized. Here's an example closer to home. This is Salt Lake City. Looks like the exact same chart. Well, it is, except for the numbers are smaller. So in 1970, Salt Lake City itself was 200,000 people, and the region was less than 1 million. It was pretty comparable to Boise's region today. And now the regional population for Salt Lake City is more than 2.5 million people, and the city's population is still 200,000 people. So again, that last round of zoning ordinances, you've achieved success. You've consumed a tremendous amount of land, which almost is impossible to serve with any kind of transportation system because you expected everyone to drive, and turns out they are. And so I start with that because here's our chart for Boise and where we're headed, and what's being projected is that this pattern will continue in Boise, where the region will go tremendously, the city not so much, so that the regional population will grow much more than the city's population. The city's population will be fairly modest. The issue with these charts is the issues that people associate with negatives associated with growth, especially transportation problems, congestion, and issues related to housing, they have to do with the dispersion of people, not the concentration of them. This idea that growth within the city or a place like Victory is somehow contributing to the problem, what history tells us is no, it's the opposite of that. When you disperse yourselves in low density ways across the entire landscape, that's what creates these problems. And it brings challenges in terms of infrastructure, because you're talking about existing neighborhoods where new development's happening. So you want to make sure people that live here now are benefiting from this. So the infrastructure challenges are very different than, pushing the infrastructure further out of the city. But here we are in Boise, rewriting our zoning ordinance as the city is growing so quickly, and it's such an opportunity to avoid those mistakes that so many other cities have realized through that last round of zoning ordinances that were created a generation ago. So here's where we stand with the zoning rewrite. You all are familiar with this. It started in the fall of 2020. We've had a tremendous amount of community outreach associated with the standards that are now being proposed in this ordinance. That includes, a rewrite of the entire zoning map. So we would move to new zoning designations, new use permissions on property, and then into the design standards. And then this last round of public meetings we had were related to what's called Module 3, which happens to deal with the process that we follow to get zoning approvals in the city. So here we are today, now in the winter, and we're proceeding with the submission of a actual new ordinance that can begin its public hearing process and round of considerations by the Planning and Zoning Commission and ultimately City Council here. Regarding community outreach overall, I wanted to make the point that this is the way the process works, in the sense that you have ideas and seeking to address the problems that people are most concerned about. In Boise's case, certainly transportation is one, and housing affordability is another, and protection of nature, all these kinds of things. We have very important things that people are telling us are important to them about this city. So we have public meetings and we seek input, and then we respond to that with changes. That's the way the process works. I know it can be frustrating for people. Sometimes they come to a meeting and express an opinion or send an email or a letter, and they sometimes expect a new ordinance immediately. Well, the way it has to work is we're collecting ideas from so many people that we want to take that into account and then come back with responses to those. We did that this past summer, for instance, when we came back with modules 1 and 2 and said, hey, we listened in that first round of public meetings, didn't go great. So now we've got some changes that we're going to propose to modules 1 and 2. So it's an iterative process as we're going through these public processes and getting feedback from residents. And this slide just shows you the number of meetings that we had, the surveys that were done, all the ideas that we've been receiving throughout this process. That includes most recently with this module 3, talking about the zoning processes. These are the meetings that we had, 4 in-person meetings around the city, and then 1 Zoom meeting. For module 3, we did a survey of people that were participating during module 3 meetings, and this is the kind of results that we got here. You can see from the surveys where people were and the age of most of the participants, or the age groups where we had the most people participating in these public meetings around module 3. I just wanted to remind you of, you were all, I think, at some point at one of these meetings, at least one of them on module 3, but just to remind you of some of the contents of that. So one issue with this process part is that when you're regulating construction of all kinds on thousands of parcels, there's some degree of complexity associated with it. But what we were trying to do in this process module is simplify as much as we could, still some complexity, but the way that we approached it to try to simplify is to create these different application types. So there's 4 types. I'll remind you of what those are in just a minute. So that's the first thing. We did create this alternative or approved allowed use, allowed form versus alternative form idea, which has gotten plenty of debate on all sides. And we'll get into that. The interdepartmental review process to kind of formalize early reviews of developments involving all of our inside the city departments that are involved in this, but our partner agencies as well. Reintroducing the hearing examiner, elevating the design review committee to a commission, which helps with some of the process issues, and then updating all of our development findings to be consistent with the kinds of things that we're saying we want for Boise now in the future through this new ordinance. These are the 4 application types. So they run on the left from the simplest things, which you do at the counter when you come in. Type 2 is more complex, but these are things that don't have a public process associated with them. Type 3 are projects that do have to go to a public meeting, whether it's the Planning and Zoning Commission or Design Review or Historic Preservation Commission. And then the type 4 are those things that actually come to council. So these are the highest level things that involve some kind of policy decision. We did include a list of what those things are, so I won't go through these in detail now, but this is a list we presented at the very first of these public meetings that we were doing on Module 3. It was part of the ordinance, so everybody's had time to weigh in on this. Lots of opinions, as you can imagine, about this idea in general and also about specific things and where they fall in this list. And some of the things we heard as themes through this process in Module 3, the quality of developer and neighborhood meetings is key to success. Having a consistent, predictable process for all parties involved. A lot of positive feedback on the interdepartmental review agency. Still things to work out as to making sure that that works in a predictable way. A lot of discussion towards the end of the Module 3 public meetings about 5G and additional potential city regulations related to that. Concerns about whether neighborhood associations are really representative of the community. Questions about the hearing examiner role and responsibilities. Suggestions as to maybe additional responsibilities for the hearing examiner. A lot of discussion about partner with other cities. If Boise's seeking to achieve certain outcomes with this, how are we working with our neighboring cities and counties and so forth. A lot of support for the development tracker, which our staff has developed, which gives people a lot more easy sight into what development's happening in their neighborhood. Consider keeping some kind of neighborhood association, notification associated with those type 2 approvals that I had on the list just a moment ago. The 2 on the top here are related, concerns about when it's best to have information get public about an individual development, and then, when is too soon to have details come out, just because if it's too soon, it may be information that's not even that important yet and could concern people or whatever. Just questions about being careful about that. Quite a bit of discussion about standardizing the communications related to the neighborhood meetings around individual development projects. It's not consistent now, and can we develop a way in which we're getting consistent communication on that? And then allocated a definitive amount of time where neighborhood associations are allowed to speak on any individual application that comes to a public meeting. I wanted to mention a few other topics we're still discussing. We talked with the Citizen Advisory Committee about these in, I guess it was December at our meeting, just some things that have just come up consistently or come up at these CAC meetings that we still are working on. Honestly, the staff that's here and all of the staff working on this, Jessica Zelag's team, Andrea and Delaney, and I'm sorry, Deanna and Lena in particular, are doing such an incredible amount of work to try to get us to the finish line on this. So this list is not all inclusive, but these were some headline issues related to the affordability and sustainability incentives and whether those should be coupled together or split apart, question mark. Industrial zones and just some additional protections within industrial zones for adjacent residential use. You all had the big discussion about Blue Valley. Council mayor and council expressed a lot of interest in finding ways to better protect not just Blue Valley, but where you've got adjoining neighborhoods. Zone changes, we're keeping the T2 zone, which is around Micron. We're keeping the health services zone, which is where our big hospitals are, St. Al's and St. Luke's in particular, keeping those zones. We're not changing the zoning that exists for those campuses. Questions about height limits or how we regulate height, that includes in the MX3 and the MX4, 60 feet enough, and then also more residential related height questions. Should we move to a number of stories and a number of feet so that concerns that, for instance, if you've got a 40-foot height restriction, that you could get potentially 4-story buildings. That's not what we're seeking. It was really 3-story buildings. So 3-story and 40 feet. So adding that, and then discussion about drive-throughs and where we permit those. And the draft that we had discussed, including over the summer in module 2, what was in the draft throughout the summer and throughout the year, was that drive-throughs would only be permitted in the MX2, which is, pretty restrictive area. And so there's discussion of, should we expand that? And if we do, what might the restrictions around drive-throughs in other districts, like an MX3, for instance, what might those restrictions be to ensure that they're not disrupting the pedestrian-oriented design that we're seeking, especially for those MX3 areas, we've got our best transit service. So here we are as it relates to the remainder of 2023 and the process. So we're working, I sent a memo to everybody here before Christmas about would like your feedback so we can discuss it and incorporate it as needed. As we're working on a draft that could get officially submitted at the end of February. So the official process can begin then. So we would release the official ordinance in end of February such that it could get to the Planning and Zoning Commission for public hearings at the end of April. And then ultimately the City Council in June for public hearings, such that we could get it adopted in the summer. And then we can decide at that point what the effective date of the ordinance would be. And there'll be discussion about that. What would be the best date to basically, transition from the current ordinance to the new one. That's a big move. Once you have decided this will be the new rules to turn over to the new ordinance. So, and we're working obviously internally at PDS, but really across all our departments, in how do we operationalize this thing, and, heavy lift with IT and our legal department and HR and many others. So we're all working on that. So we'll come to what's the effective date once we get a little bit closer to when council has this in front of you for consideration in the summer. So I think that's it. Yeah, with that, I'm happy to answer questions or take observations from any of you.
All right. Thanks, Tim. I was really pleased to see the amount of work that's been done and the speed with which Module 3 really got a lot of citizen feedback and had all of those meetings, a couple of which I attended, and it was really well done. And I think our staff is just incredible at performing public meetings. It's not easy to, stand up in front of people and give them information that is, wonky and confusing. And then expecting folks to then respond to that information that was given to them. And so I think that you all are really amazing. My question is about the pipeline of potential development projects. How do you foresee this timeline impacting development applications coming in? Like, do you think that there'll be a bunch that come in before the new zoning code goes into effect? Or do you think that people will hold off until the new zoning code goes into effect? What do you think that will?
Mayor, Councilmember Woodings, I think, we've been discussing that and discussing a lot, quite a bit, as you might expect, around this transition to the new ordinance and what the impact of that will be. I think it's going to cut both ways, really. You're going to have, and we've had cases where people are very interested in the new regulations and feel they would be helpful. And so you may have cases where you've got folks delaying submission as a result of that. And then you'll have other cases where perhaps it will accelerate submission of some. So we're trying to track that and come to you with that has a lot to do with this effective date question that I left as a question mark as to what that effective date would be. Is to your very point, what's the impact going to be in terms of volume and where do we stand? And as a result of that, how do we best identify when that effective date is? So it's a really important question that you put your finger on that we're really digging into right now.
Great, thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Boy, to this team out here in the audience, thank you. This has been an incredible lift over the last couple of years, and you've all done really great work. So, first of all, my thanks to all of you. I think that we're at a really good spot with this. You asked us all to provide some comments on that last draft. I expect that those will be addressed some way in whatever we see in February, and look forward to seeing some of those changes. I guess my biggest question is, will we have a chance once we see that to respond back again to whatever changes are made in response to those comments that we provided for you, and also the comments that you referenced that we saw from the public? So we'll all see it publicly. Obviously, it'll be available to the public. Are we going to have another chance to provide any comment before it gets scheduled for a public hearing and is out of our hands, essentially?
Well, there will not be another, work session to talk through other edits that could occur with the proposal. I think any of you that would like to talk through any of the suggestions you've made, I'm happy to do that. And we can get with staff as well to talk through any details that you'd like to over the next couple of weeks. Absolutely. But once we get to beyond January, it's going to be ordinance drafting time.
Right.
And then we'll get to the point where the ordinance is submitted for consideration at the end of February. But of course, as it goes through the public hearing process, there's certainly the opportunity to make edits in conjunction with your consideration and any kind of vote on it. But I would really offer that ideally, if you have anything you'd like to talk through, even related to things that you've submitted to us, let's do that right now. And we can talk through what our thoughts are about what you suggested.
Yeah, thank you. So just for reference for my fellow council members, since they weren't part of the comments that you referenced, two of the things, especially that I sent comments on that probably weren't otherwise part of the public record, I think in part because people probably haven't gotten to that level of detail, frankly. One is parking lots. I think that as I look at the parking lot standards that we're proposing, we can probably do better, especially as it relates to sustainability and trees and those kinds of things in parking lots. So looking forward to seeing how you all respond to that. And then the other one that I have suggested is that if you're adaptively reusing an existing residential building, that the process to do that is much easier than even the process that we've already currently outlined for adding 3 or 4 plexes with new construction. So I just wanted to make those public, that those were things that I had commented on, added to the public comments that you daylighted for us in the presentation that you gave us. And thank you for all that.
Thank you.
And Councilmember, this will be the last comment.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Tim. I just want to echo my colleagues in praising our staff and what a wonderful job they did in engaging with the community. I, like my colleagues, had an opportunity to attend a variety of those meetings, and it is a public meeting. We get folks with different interests and different passions, and there are folks who are very passionate about their particular issue. And what I observed was the high amount of respect that you showed people. It's very easy to dismiss a person because they don't communicate like everybody else. And all I saw was the kind of professionalism I'd like to see throughout our entire organization exemplified by this department. And so I just want to thank you for treating people with dignity and respect. The other thing I want to say is I have an appreciation for the difficult challenge that this is. You know, a lot of the folks, I think, who tend to show up to those community conversations, those listening sessions, were folks from neighborhoods. I've had an opportunity to talk to at least one small developer, and they explained to me the challenges of trying to have this type of a career, trying to make a living, and having deadlines be pivotal. And so I'm hoping that we're getting some input from those small developers who can give a unique perspective of what it's like to do these jobs in an environment where the deadlines are so important, and hopefully have some reassurance that our new zoning code is going to make it possible for that work, for their work to continue. If there's anything we've learned over the last few years, it's the importance of the smaller businesses in our community. And I think we tend to paint developers with all one brush. And the truth is we have women who work in development. My guess is that's a small group of folks. You wouldn't guess that from what we see in our audience today of the folks who work in that capacity for the city. But I think it's important that we get those voices at the table and that we reassure them this new zoning code is going to make it possible for them to continue in this type of work. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you to the whole team for being here tonight too. And with that, we need to move into executive session.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I move that we go into executive session to discuss pending and probable litigation pursuant to Idaho Code Section 74206(1)(f).
Second.
You have a motion, a second. Clerk, will you call the roll?
Bajent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Willetts.
Yes.
Woodings.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.